Thank you very much. We have lots of similarities based on your presentation. I'm going to start off talking about really our governance model and how we nationally deal with natural hazard risk management in New Zealand. So just like Japan, we're part of the Ring of Fire, and New Zealand sits on a subduction zone where the Australian plate is subducting underneath the Pacific plate. The Kermadec Trench, which I believe is about 2,000 kilometres long, comes and deeply steeps underneath New Zealand, and that's called the Hikurangi Trench. This is the source of one of our biggest risks in New Zealand because it has the capability of generating quite large earthquakes and tsunami. That trench then buckles and twists right under one of our major cities, our capital city Wellington, in between the two islands, and then it turns into a different type of fault, which we see a lot of our major earthquakes also capable of generating magnitude 8 to 9 earthquakes. That fault then continues underneath the South Island and it shoots out into another subduction zone, so it changes where the Persica Trench, or Pusica, depending where you're from, then subducts under one another, and that can also generate tsunami. So I believe in 200 AD, if it wasn't in Japanese. Oh, you've changed it to English. Thank you so much. I can tell you the facts properly. It generated a tsunami so big that it actually left sediment in Australia. Unlike Japan, we don't have very recent history of natural hazard events of that scale, so it can be very hard to engage with the public from a preparedness perspective. So because of that geological setting, we face many of the same hazards that Japan faces. It also means that we have quite a large annual loss from natural hazard events. This is due to the size of the country and also having a very small economy. So we're very, very vulnerable to natural hazard risk. It's about 1 billion annualized loss. This is a 50-year probabilistic figure. And that then you have to add on 3 other costs to get the overall amount that we have to basically ensure we have as a country to respond to a natural hazard event. So it's quite costly for us as a small country. And we have quite a few similarities to Japan. We straddle plate boundaries in the Ring of Fire. We have some of our biggest towns and cities that are on active fault zones. Mountain ranges prone to landslides and rockfalls, and obviously significant tsunami. We both are trying our best to manage those things, and again, here are some similarities that I've pulled together between Japan and New Zealand. We're not as advanced with our early warning systems. We're moving towards having more robust national risk models, digital twins, and we have quite a huge investment in resilience. And these are some of the things that I'll talk about from a national perspective today. So if we look again in comparison, some of our biggest cities are built on, this is an active volcanic field. Auckland, there's a population that's expected to be around 2.5 million in the next 5 years, and that's built on an active volcanic field. Wellington, where we have come from today, this is our capital city. We have decided in our ancestors' past to build that on an active fault zone. And this is the southernmost city of the North Island before we have the Cook Strait and the South Island from that first map that I showed you. We also have Christchurch, but I'll show you some photos of that a bit later. So this is an example of the way our government is set up in New Zealand, and I thought this was quite useful to include, and after seeing your slides just before, it is actually very similar. So underneath our cabinet, we have ministers who then form parliament, and then under that we have a variety, probably just as many as yours, and I didn't list them all because there are so many, government departments, crown agencies, and different other bodies that are tasked under legislation to manage our risks, whether they be security and intelligence risks or natural hazard risks. And then underneath that, we have other people that form part of our government, which are science and research institutes or other. How this works in a response, and also in peacetime, so that they manage risk, thinking about the whole system, is we have a National Security Committee. Underneath this, we have the Officials Committee for Domestic and External Security Coordination, and the chief executives of our ministries sit on ODESC. Underneath that, there is a secretariat that is tasked to identify risks of national significance for security and intelligence, such as cyber attacks or terrorism, and then a national hazards board that's tasked to do the same. And that's generally environmental risks and national natural hazard risks. So under these two boards, in peacetime, outside of an emergency, these two boards are working across the agencies. On the left-hand side, it could be the Ministry of Civil Defence, the Ministry for the Environment, or others, to ensure that we've got systems in place to be able to manage risks, so hopefully they never turn into an event. The primary legislations that we have in New Zealand sit across the Resource Management Act, which is tasked to ensure that we build in good places, so not on fault lines if we can help it. The Building Act is there to mainly ensure that we build strong, resilient buildings. And then the Local Government Act really does have a focus on community resilience. And in New Zealand, the way that we try to focus on reducing risk is at the local, community and personal level. So that means it's tasked by a local and regional government, and also ensuring our communities take responsibility for understanding and reducing risk where they can. It goes further than that and becomes more complex, which will speak to the slides that we saw before. Aside from this piece of legislation, we have numerous other pieces of law and agencies that are tasked to also reduce natural hazard risk. So up there is the agency that I work for, which is the Natural Hazards Commission, but you also have civil defence, similar to how you have in Japan, and fire and emergency. And their roles in an event or outside of an event vary quite differently. So it's really important that the national policies and plans we have work together. And of course, more often than not, they don't. Because under these plans and processes, we then have regional, district, and local risk management plans and policies. Normally, and how they should relate to the national plans and policies, but that can be quite hard. And the list is endless here, and the responsibilities are also endless. This can make it quite hard, particularly with the types of hazards that we have in New Zealand, particularly if they're complex. And of course, no single agency is tasked with addressing every aspect of hazard risk management. And this is only a sample, because there's more. This all is underpinned by having a really strong focus on national resilience. We have a national resilience strategy, and the purpose of that is really to anticipate and resist the things that we have assessed in New Zealand and make sure that we can reduce that risk, recover, and then continue to build back better from there. This National Disaster Resilience Strategy is aligned with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. The purpose is to understand risk in all of its dimensions so that we can prioritize our investment in how we want to reduce risk. Anything that we can't then reduce, we can transfer and hopefully use insurance. So I've pulled this together in a bit of a rush, but this is the way that understanding of risk in all its dimensions and managing of it is applied in New Zealand. We want to try and avoid the risk. In doing so, we can reduce the impact, we can save our money and access to insurance for when we really need it, reduce the risk where we can't avoid it. That takes all of the agencies that I've listed on the left-hand side, and that's everybody, including the private sector, not just the government, also science and research, and of course, homeowners. And what we find more often than not is that we have an event where there is a gap or someone is making a poor decision within one of these lists on the left-hand side. Essentially, you all have to be singing from the same song sheet and working together to ensure we can effectively reduce risk. And of course, many of these agencies are either involved or impacted if we haven't been able to reduce the risk. The risk that we can't reduce, we transfer via insurance. We have a government insurance scheme in New Zealand, so if you purchase home insurance with a property, you automatically get covered with natural hazards insurance. It's a different scheme to you have here in Japan. We'll talk about that a bit later. You get up to $300,000 paid out by the Natural Hazards Commission if there is impact from a natural hazards on your property. Anything else over that amount will get paid out by your private insurer. An example of some of those are on the bottom. And then if we can't transfer all of the risk, we just have to accept the loss. And that's where a lot of our public education comes in and the fact that we have to have the ability to have a strong response through fire and emergency services. One of the things, as an example, under civil defence is having good awareness to some of the major events we face in New Zealand. This is an example of our earthquake and tsunami public education program. All of our coastlines in New Zealand are at risk of tsunami, and we start young with educating our children in what to do if they feel an earthquake and a tsunami. It's a complex system to manage, and this is an example because we don't manage every hazard the same, which makes it really difficult for the public to understand. So I've given you an example here for our tsunami warning system. We are nowhere near as advanced as Japan, and I wish we were. We rely heavily on the Pacific Tsunami Warning System and our local earthquake detection agency. There's a network around New Zealand called GeoNet. That information then goes back and forth, which is timely and cumbersome, and it sometimes takes anywhere between 45 minutes to 4 hours to be able to inform the public if a tsunami may have been generated or not. The Ministry of Civil Defence and Emergency Management, MacDem on the slide, will work if needed with GeoNet and a tsunami experts panel to then push the triggers to local government, who then inform communities. This is the system that if I had the chance to change, I would, because I believe that unlike obviously the intelligent systems that you're trying to build to help support your communities, we could really benefit from, because it would cut out a lot of the toing and froing and decision making. So our overall resilience challenges are based on the fact that we have extremely high exposure to natural hazard risks in New Zealand, and because we are a small country with a small economy, this makes it quite hard to manage. As the slides at the start I showed you, it's not just our big cities that we've built in vulnerable places, it's also our smaller towns and villages. We're a largely coastal living country. That means we have legacy planning issues to manage. And here's just an example of some of the things that we've experienced in the past 15 years and the cost of those events. And they span lots of different things, through to earthquakes, through to tsunami, the Kaikoura earthquake. We're very lucky that there was some people not in a property on the South Island in a little area called Pigeon Bay, because the power of the tsunami actually knocked the building off its foundations. So this is a lot for us to have to manage, and unfortunately we don't have a holistic approach. We have an all hazards approach, which means that sometimes some hazards can get left out in how we prioritize and manage those risks. It's quite a reactive system, and it often means that it takes an event for something to happen. But having said that, we have excellent science, data and models in our country, and that is all used to underpin making really good decisions and making good policy for us to be able to build systems and networks that we know are missing. And I'm going to show you an example of that later as well. But principally, we take a multi-hazard approach. On the left-hand side, it shows the extent of all the information that we use, the agencies or organizations in the middle that then take that information, science, data to be able to make some good decisions through policy, practice, or the public. And our overall intention, as outlined in our National Disaster Resilience Strategy, is to reduce our overall risk. Therefore, we have the reduced impact, and we don't have the extreme cost on the economy, because we certainly don't have that 1 billion sitting there ready for multiple events in the country. An example of how we use science is across all of these different things listed on this slide. So it goes into business cases for being able to procure large pieces of technology, guidance, strategies, international reporting, such as the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And it's really important for how we do our national exercises, similar to what you showed us in the SIP introduction before. Here's an example, though, of when you have to use that science and evidence for one natural hazard, the different types of legislation that is involved in managing that hazard. Underneath these different pieces of legislation, there's the agencies that are responsible. So for tsunami in our country, here is the different pieces of standards, codes, guidance, or regulations, the extent of the policies that cross just one hazard, which means it can make it quite challenging. Having said that, the positive thing is that it means we have quite a lot of data, evidence, and information to be able to make some good decisions. An example of that is when we built the New Zealand Monitoring and Detection Network, the Dark Buoy system. So prior to 2018, we had absolutely no monitoring or detection of tsunami in New Zealand. We relied on 3 dark buoys that the Americans had put near New Zealand, but when there was a change in government in America, those dark buoys were removed very rapidly from our coast. We used that as an opportunity. 3 government agencies from the list I showed you got together and said, our communities are exposed. We know that we have significant tsunami risk in this country. We have to do something about it. So a bit of a snapshot on the top of the screen, you'll see different changes in our government at the time, which does make a difference because in New Zealand, when you have a change in a national governance party, they do have different priorities, and more often than not, that can impact the outcomes of a project. We were very lucky that it didn't do that here. So this is an example to show you how science really did drive the outcome of a national decision. So from 2005, that's when we really understood our national tsunami risk in New Zealand, and it was following the Bande Aceh event. The government spent quite a bit of money to better understand what is New Zealand's risk, seeing as we're on top of a subduction zone. Nothing really happened then. We spent all of our time and effort really responding to the Canterbury earthquakes because that had such a huge impact on New Zealand. So that's another example of how the country really stopped thinking about one hazard because all the efforts went into a different hazard. During that time in the background, certain things were happening where we were progressing different options and assessments of different risk that we might face from different types of fault rupture around New Zealand. We had ministerial briefings, we had economic reports into what the loss might be to New Zealand if a big event happened. We then started to have, very fortuitously and thankfully no loss of lives, a series of events, large earthquakes and one tsunami. That then made government ministers and officials say, okay, we need to do something about this. So for us, it was useful. We then had the ability to stand up a all hazards monitoring and detection centre. Without that before, we had no officials awake. We had nobody at night monitoring what could happen in New Zealand. But by implementing that, it meant that we could progress and proceed to asking for more equipment. In 2017, we tried to get support from the Pacific Tsunami Warning System. We worked very closely with our Japanese colleagues because of the amount of work you have done in your detection of tsunamis in here. That really did help us inform what we could do in New Zealand and how we should do it. We had trips to the Pacifica Marine Environmental Laboratory in America, and we ended up deciding that the best thing to do was to build bespoke technology for New Zealand. During that time, it was quite hard to advocate because we had another change in government. So we had to commission a special scientific report very quickly, where key scientists in New Zealand and some from overseas, had to basically say, what is the worst case that we could have here? And this is where we understood that we have a 25% chance of a magnitude 8 or 9 earthquake generating a huge tsunami on that Hikurangi Trench. And it was that allowed our Prime Minister at the time to say, whew, can't have that. And they invested in the system. So there was a year of very intense work, briefings to ministers, business cases, reports, that we had a variety of Pacific Tsunami Warning System colleagues come to Wellington to work with us. We had our Japanese colleagues from Jemal online. And by 2019, we got 12 DART buoys. This is an example of the science and the evidence being the key driver to change policy, practice, and now the research coming out of these DART buoys that are already in the ocean and have been since 2018 are being used to do things like create our models that we want for our own digital twins. So as an example, we had 8 scientific reports, 18 briefings to ministers, aid memoirs are updates to different agencies. We had 2 national business cases. That's the process we have to go through our Treasury in New Zealand in order to try and get some money from that very small pot we have. And we had a legislative framework change. It's a really good example of how we've been able to make a positive change to policy and practice. The evidence from these DART buoys are going into quite an aspirational system. Much of this work is already completed under our Resilience to Nature's challenges, which is money that researchers in New Zealand can apply for through the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment across all natural hazards. And here's where we want to be with doing a digital New Zealand resilience engine, as a scientist back home in New Zealand calls it. But it's working towards being able to build an earthquake and tsunami digital twin. We have aspirations to also put other things within this, other national models that can help us do better scenario and loss modelings. We can understand what are the rapid emergency systems that we might need in place. What is the potential loading on a building if we had an earthquake and a tsunami followed by rainfall? Because just like you experienced after Kaikoura, we had an earthquake, a tsunami, and days later we had severe flooding from a severe rainfall event. That meant we had landslides to deal with as well from the earthquake shaking. Having a model like this and building it into a digital twin is our aspiration. Moving on to what we have in place if everything else fails is our insurance system. So the overall objective of our scheme is to provide New Zealanders with access to affordable and available residential natural hazards insurance. So the scheme is one of the oldest in the world. It's changed a couple of times. It used to be the earthquake and war scheme. And after a large earthquake that we had in Napier, a lot of people could not rebuild their homes because they had to take on the costs themselves. And that's when the government decided that they needed to do something about it. Over time, other natural hazards were added to the scheme so that people could have that assurance that if something happened to them, they would be financially protected. So it's a part of the resilience ecosystem from a financial perspective. The insurance covers buildings and land, but because there has been so many flooding events in our country, residential properties are no longer covered for flooding in our country. It's just the land around the property that's covered. So it's an example of if you don't manage the risk in the first hand and you rely too much on insurance, there will be insurance retreat. So on the slide, it's an example of the hazards that we do cover. There's a maximum cover of 300,000. And that can be a replacement to your property if it's agreed with your insurer, or it could be a payout for a specified amount for you to do repairs to your property. The scheme was really tested after the Christchurch earthquake, and still now, almost 15 years later, we are still trying to deal with it from an insurance perspective. And this is an example of the bits of your property that's covered. So it can be quite confusing and quite complex for our community members, quite hard for people to understand. So we do have cases when people expect to have an insurance payout and they don't. The scheme supports extremely high levels of insurance availability in New Zealand, which is, it still shocks me because of the amount of risk we have. So we have quite high penetration of insurance in New Zealand. I think this is a sign that the international reinsurance market, they see that we have a lot of risk, but they also see that we do have a best endeavours measures across the private sector, the public sector, and organisations to try and reduce our exposure to natural hazard risks. So this is just focusing on residential. This doesn't include commercial. I know that in many other countries, governments have schemes that are just focused on specific types of natural hazards. Ours covers the hazards that I showed on the screen before. It also helps to reduce the financial impact of natural hazards when they occur in New Zealand. So this is just to give you a picture of the potential hardship that people can face after different earthquakes in different cities across across the globe. Private and public earthquake insurance in other countries often impose quite high deductibles. We don't have that in New Zealand, or they can limit coverage. This usually is to make insurance much more affordable. Also, homeowners can opt into doing private insurance themselves. In New Zealand, it's compulsory. If you have home insurance, you have to pay a levy so that you get insured by the Natural Hazards Commission. We have a mission to reduce the impact on people and property, and we do that through 4 R's of resilience, risk financing, being ready to respond, and having a strong recovery. Because we understand people want their money, people want their property. After an event, that's the first thing people, well, and well-being. But it's well-being, loss of life, my loved ones. Am I going to be financially okay? Can I get in my property? That drives a lot of what we do to build resilience. So our insurance scheme also includes doing things to help people reduce the impact from natural hazards. I'm just going to give you an example of some of the most significant events that we've had that have really tested the scheme. So one that you will all know is Christchurch. This was Tuesday the 22nd of February 2011. Significant loss of life for a small country like New Zealand. Even one loss of life with 5 million people is considered nationally significant for us. Huge economic losses, huge amount of claims, and it was the first time that we had to deplete the fund, the Natural Hazards Insurance Fund. All of the money we'd saved up over all of the years before where we hadn't experienced an event was gone. We had to ask the Crown, we had to ask the government for more money so that we could pay out all of those that were insured. Here's some before and after photos. And we now have areas of Christchurch, this was called a red zone afterwards, that still looks like this now. If we'd have done some improved risk reduction, knowing what we know now, we probably would not have built here. This is marshland. It's hugely liquefiable, and we have a lot of our properties across the country that are in these high-risk zones. So an example of legacy issues that we have to try and manage. We had 400,000 tons of liquefaction to deal with. Huge learning for us across the country, huge learning for scientists then going into first responders of how we have to deal with that amount of sediment that used to be below the ground. And that was only the earthquake. The claims handling was extremely complex, and that's why we're still dealing with it today. House insurance policies for full replacement, sum insured. That meant that for each policy where a repair or build could not be facilitated, insurers and customers had to negotiate per every single property on the total amount they had to be paid out. This is where there are advantages to the system you have in Japan, the parametric insurance system. Huge delays, very unhappy customers. This all led to a change in the scheme. We moved from being the Earthquake Commission to the Natural Hazards Commission just recently. A lot of this was driven by a national Crown inquiry into our ability to respond and provide insurance after this event. The second example is the Kaikoura earthquake. We had barely finished responding and recovering from Christchurch. A very remote area. At the time, I was working for the Ministry of Civil Defence and Emergency Management, and I was on duty, and we felt this earthquake very strongly in Wellington. Kaikoura is on the South Island, quite near Christchurch. And when I felt the earthquake in Wellington, I was convinced we'd had another Christchurch earthquake. At the time, I rushed straight to Parliament. That's where our bunker is, our emergency response centre, and there were already ministers there demanding to know if there'd been a tsunami. So I was quite pleased that they were well educated, that we could get tsunamis. But at the same time, we had no knowledge because at that time we only had tsunami gauges, and because of how much the coast rose in that event, all the tsunami gauges were in the air. So they couldn't record the tsunami when it came onto the land. The only way we knew we had that event was in daylight. The next day we could go and we did reconnaissance. There was quite a lot of damage in Wellington, and this is the thing that we struggled the most with because peak ground accelerations were around 0.2 G, and that's because the shaking went up the coast, up towards Wellington. So many Cantabrians didn't even feel the earthquake, despite from a geographical perspective them being much closer. Now, I'm not an earthquake engineer, and I'm in a room with a lot of earthquake engineers, so I'm not going to talk any more about ground shaking. Here's an example of how much the ground rose in that event, which I'm sure you've seen that picture a lot of. So looking again at the insurance scheme and how that worked, we'd learned a lot from Christchurch, so we could do things a lot quicker. We had a new model, it was faster, settlements were more streamlined. But again, this event drove us to know that we had to do a lot better. Clear decision making, working better, and having a national disaster response model was what we knew we had to work towards. And this is how it works. The New Zealand government, via the Natural Hazards Commission, sets the levy and a finance strategy. We have to work together with our private insurance partners so that residential buildings are covered for the natural hazards that we face. Then we had Cyclone Gabrielle. This was one of the biggest events, and it shouldn't have been, that we've had to pay out for in the history of our whole scheme. The reason why this was so costly was because of the fact we have so many buildings in New Zealand built on floodplains. So again, a legacy planning issue. We have increased our risk and the trajectory of our risk knowingly and unknowingly so. And that's a big area for us in a policy management perspective, because even now, since this event, we are still seeing local planning at the district level advocate to remove science and modelling that shows where flooding could happen and where tsunamis could happen out of their district plans so they can build more buildings. We have a housing supply issue in New Zealand. We don't have enough buildings for the rate that our population is increasing. And in that case, the government is putting pressure on the local districts to build more properties. And the only way to build in our current communities is to densify those that already have quite high risk. It's these events that are making us deplete the scheme a lot quicker than intended. That's why at the Natural Hazards Commission, we have a huge focus on trying to reduce risk. If we reduce risk and we can build resilience, we can inform, enable, and influence the choices and decisions that reduce our exposure and vulnerability of our built environment to natural hazards, then we can keep our insurance scheme wholesome, we can protect lives, and we can advocate for building to be done in smarter areas across the country. We invest in science and research, part of that system I showed you at the start, which again is quite different for an insurance agency to do. And it's about 10 to 20 million a year, which actually isn't that much in the scheme of things. And we're trying to understand our hazards, our exposure, so the things and the assets that are at risk from natural hazards, our vulnerability, what don't we want the things that we care about to be impacted, and how to reduce and manage those risks. Then we aim to get that into the hands of the people that can really make a difference. And we do that by working very closely with people like Ken, supporting engineers, builders, and planners to make smart decisions. We make submissions on those plans to try and advocate people to not build in high-risk areas. We do opinion pieces. We try and change and influence the way that people understand natural hazards, and we work with communities. The scheme provides about 90% coverage for New Zealand, so it's quite a lot, really. It's quite hard to do for some of the more lower socioeconomic parts of our country, but we're always trying to look at how to make the scheme more equitable. And we also factor in different types of scenarios based on that science and evidence that we've acquisitioned via our risk modelling that we do closely with our CRIs, because similar to what was on the previous page, the less costly curves can be drawn from other different hazards. Earthquake is what pushes it up for us in New Zealand. And very quickly on reinsurance. Us being able to obtain reinsurance since 1988 is the primary way that we've been able to avoid large shocks. It will provide the additional resource and cover when we don't have the Crown guarantee or when we've used the Crown guarantee. The cost of purchasing reinsurance can be several times what's expected from the annual recovery. The Commission will pay sometimes $3 million in reinsurance premiums. It's very high. We're continually assessing how to be more efficient and effective, and working with those other government agencies that we have in New Zealand to try and make sure that we have a wholesome scheme, that we use modelling, showing whether or not we have increased or decreased our expected losses. That can change every year. That information then goes with my chief executive on her reinsurance trip when she works with all the reinsurers to try and get more guarantee that if something happens in New Zealand, we are protected. So there is some level of certainty as to how we model things, and that then has an impact on the reinsurer's appetite to give New Zealand more money or not. So that was quite a large walk through our system that we have in New Zealand to manage natural hazard risks, but hopefully my colleagues will give you more in-depth talks on different pieces of that, whether it's how we work with the local communities to build understanding of risk and build resilience, and the science and modelling that goes into some of the decisions we make at that political level, and also how that impacts our insurance. And that's me. Arigatou gozaimasu.